Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to writer and director James Vanderbilt and actor Leo Woodall about their movie Nuremberg. And James, in starting with you and talking about the way that you've told this story, in essence, you have Douglas Kelly and Robert Jackson in these kind of two stories that then eventually intertwine within the trial itself. And I was interested in, as you started to write the script and really spend a year or so on research in those early stages, how you started to see the ideation of telling the story narratively in that way.
No, thank you so much. No, it's interesting because I came to this through Jack L. Hyde's book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, a book proposal, which was really about Kelly and Göring, and sort of took place in that cell. So when I started working on this, I thought I was going to be telling a much smaller movie and a much smaller story. And then I dove into research and learned about Robert Jackson, Michael Shannon's character, and learned that, so much of this movie for me was learning things about something I thought I knew a lot about and realizing I knew very little about it, which is exciting to me as a filmmaker too, because I feel like if I don't know about it, there are a lot of other people who don't know about it. So we'll be excavating kind of new territory. But I read about Robert Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice, who basically said we have to have these trials. The U.S. Army had no interest in prosecuting the Nazis. In fact, they were supposed to be shot within 48 hours of capture. There was a standing order from Churchill and Roosevelt. And Jackson said, no, that's not okay. We need to do this. We need to put these men on trial. And not only that, it can't just be the U.S. It has to be an international coalition. It has to be the British. It has to be the French. It has to be the Russians, who were not getting along with the rest of the world at that point. It was sort of the beginning of the Cold War. But he, said this is incredibly important for us to do, and then ended up taking a leave of absence and flying to Nuremberg and becoming the chief U.S. prosecutor. So for me, when I started this process, I went, oh, my movie's over here in the cell, and then I went, oh no, I think it's also over here in the courtroom. And then I read the story of Howie Trias, Leo Woodall's character, and I went, oh my gosh, my story is also over here. So as a writer, it was terrifying. It was great, but terrifying because, a lot of adaptation is about subtraction. You have a 350-page book and you can only fit it into a 2-hour movie, but this thing just kind of kept growing and growing and growing and growing. So it took a while to kind of wrestle it into shape and figure out when the baton would be passed between these intersecting storylines. They all did intersect in reality. So, but when in the movie to do those things was it took a bit of time to figure out.
And speaking of your character, Leo, it really asks a lot of you because there's so much with Howie that sits underneath the surface for so much of the movie, but has to be bubbling there the entire time, in addition to obviously learning to speak German as a whole entity. And I know that you didn't book the role until fairly close to shooting, but James kind of put you through the ringer, having you audition 17 times to really find someone who could capture all of that. And I was interested in how that process helped you when you then had to dive in fairly quickly to production and shooting.
Um, well, I don't think Jamie put me through 17, man.
17.
17 is a little extreme, but it was one of the longer audition processes, and I was given Howie's sort of arc very early through the audition process, and I dipped my toe into the German early. So when it became official that I was doing it, I had more to learn and focus on it, and I felt like I had some confidence based on having already worked a bit with Jamie through our audition process and just the work that I was doing at home. And then it kind of became about joining this elite cast and hoping that I don't let the side down.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And James, I wanted to talk a little bit about the way in which you shot all of the kind of three-hander scenes ultimately in the prison cells with Göring, because, sometimes there's a real feeling of tension and sometimes you see little flickers of possible friendship evoked from those conversations. And I know that you kind of worked very judiciously to really recreate that feeling of claustrophobia, having all of the walls directly around and having it be a literal confined space for everybody to shoot in. And why was that so important to the way that you wanted to create the feeling of all of those moments in the film?
I mean, I think it's we had an incredible production designer with Eve Stewart, who basically designed that it's a complete recreation to within an inch. She measured the real cells. She went to Nuremberg and did that. She went and got the actual blueprints for the courtrooms. So all of that is to scale. And Darius Wolski, who shot the movie, who shot 9 Ridley Scott films and 2 Tony Scott films. And when I met him, I remember saying to him, I was like, you shot Pirates of the Caribbean, right? He went, just the first 4. So, it was a sort of a level of talent behind the scenes. And in those scenes in that cell, the way you build a movie set is you build it so you can pull walls, right? So that you can, if you need to move the camera back a little bit or just pretty up the shot a little bit, you can do all of that. And Darius and I really early on made a deal with each other that we weren't going to pull a wall. That we were going to keep, Rami and Russell and Leo confined in that space so that they could feel the claustrophobia, so that the audience could feel the claustrophobia. We weren't going to cheat. I think one of the things that happens in that instance is, because it's also not just these 3 guys in there. There are 2 cameras, there are 2 camera operators, there's a guy with a boom, there's a camera assistant. So it is tight in there. But I think you feel that in the performances, I like to, as much as you can, and you can't always, because, modern filmmaking, you can't always build stuff. We were able to build a lot on this, but, as much as you can immerse the actors in a space that feels real, I think it only pays dividends in their performances.
It does. And Leo, I wanted to ask you about filming all of those scenes with Rami and Russell within that confinement, because it's such an interesting facet for your character where there's so much emotion to being present for these conversations, but at the same time, he's holding it inside because he's the conduit to the conversation as a translator. And I was really interested in how you found the way in which you wanted to approach playing all of that.
That's a really good question. It's a lot of it, was just kind of exactly what you just said. Allow it to sort of bubble away at me, and it was vital that I didn't give anything away. You don't really want to give anything away, just as from an actor's perspective. Anyway, you kind of want there to be a lot under the surface, but with Howie, there was, in character, I could quite literally play that, and so it was a quite rare and exciting gift, and and it was made easier too by what Jamie was just talking about, which is all those scenes in the cell. He and Darius's decision to do that was wonderful. It really allowed all of us to buy into the reality of the moment and the scene and the dynamic between the 2 of them and the dynamic between the 3 of them even. So yeah, I had a lot of help.
I love that. And James, I wanted to ask you about the way in which you figured out how to shoot all of the court trial scenes, because, it was the first ever televised court trial and there's footage of it on the internet that people can watch. And, I've heard you say that you really wanted to center it on the emotion in the room and the characters' experiences of being there, particularly when the footage is being projected. And so you would choose that over something that might feel more aesthetic or have more of a grandeur to it. And so how did that shape a lot of the choices that you made for those scenes?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to really show the size and scale of the courtroom. I mean, what's sort of interesting to me is sort of, so much of this movie takes place, inches, 2 or 3 people sort of inches away from each other. And then other pieces of it are, Michael Shannon and Russell Crowe 50 feet away from each other in cross-examinations. But with the courtroom stuff specifically, again, it was sort of the whole idea was, we wanted the movie to feel like a movie that was made in 2025. We didn't want it to necessarily feel like, oh, this was made in 1945 and we shot on some old film stock we found. We wanted it to feel modern for modern audiences because it feels modern for the characters going through it. With the footage we show from the camps, that's the real footage that was shown early on. Our first AD said, how do you want to do this? Do you want to shoot that? I said, no, we're not shooting anything for that. We're going to show the real footage. Our wonderful actors, when we cast them, I went to them and I said, look, I know you love to do research and I think that's great, but do me a favor, don't watch these films, even though they're out there, because I would love for it to be fresh for you on the day as much as possible. And then they all agreed to it. And on the day we had 300 extras, and we brought in a real film projector. We didn't blue screen it and comp it in later. It was we wanted everybody to actually have the same experience as the people in the courtroom did. And I went out and said a few words, and especially to explain to the background artists that this is 300 background artists playing the courtgoers. This is what we're doing today, and this is why we're doing it, but it's important. And it's going to be a hard day, but we think it's the right thing to do. And then we had a moment of silence, and then we showed the films. And what you're seeing there is they're real. Leo had a camera on him first take, and they're playing these characters and they're playing them beautifully, but they're also onboarding the power of those images, which are, I think, as powerful 80 years ago as they are today.
Yeah, absolutely. And Leo, you have a really remarkable scene with Rami, where your character talks about the fact that he's Jewish. And, for him, you get the essence of, even though the war is literally over, to him, it's not over. There's that thing of him saying, I'm going to allow myself to have a cigarette once the war is over, but he's not there yet. And so when he talks about all of this, it feels so present to that moment. And I just wanted to ask about really finding a lot of the emotion and kind of what.
That was, Jamie and I had discussed it. We obviously knew that it was a really important scene, not just to Howie, but to the movie. And, and it was written so beautifully. I didn't want to go into it going, well, I didn't want to pick it apart and make too many choices for that scene, because at the end of the day, he's and Jamie and I had sort of agreed that the best way to go about this is to just sit there and tell him this story. Just tell him the story, and not pick the points where I think it's the most emotional, or the things that I want to get across to the audience at this particular point of the story. I think we both agree that the best way was for it to be an organic, and just to tell the story organically and not plan too much ahead. But it was already there, and talk about the emotions bubbling up. They'd been bubbling up for months on this shoot, shooting these scenes, and there was a lot to naturally kind of come out of it without planning it, if that makes sense.
It does. I think it's wonderful, and probably why that scene works so well in the movie. And, James, in the way that you filmed it, I love the way that, as more is revealed, you kind of push in on Leo's character a little bit more, or kind of hold him in the edit. And you just kind of found that really gentle, when to push in with the camera, when to hold on him a little bit more for the right moments of that scene. And I just wanted to ask about the intricacy of really figuring that out and finessing it in that way.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really about not letting the camera get in the way of performance. It's sort of, we wanted to capture it without, I think the term Leo used was over egging it. It's just that, and that we covered that scene very simply. It was just, two directions, and started wide and then just moved in tighter. And and in the edit, it was the same thing. It was just sort of, this is not about, and I think Leo makes an amazing point too. It's sort of not about picking moments to hit you or something, or try and hit a point, or, it's just, it's almost like riding a wave a little bit. It's just sort of, telling the story as truthfully and as humanly as possible. And I just also have to say, Leo is one of my favorite people in the world, but I don't want to undersell the degree of difficulty of coming into a part like this. And coming into a part with a cast like this too, because Leo is a brilliant actor, but the fact that he was, and I think I said something to you at the very beginning of it too, is, you're going to be in a cell with two guys who both have Academy Awards for Best Actor. And the fact that, which I probably shouldn't have done, I probably didn't want to.
No, I'm glad you did.
But it was one of those things where it's like, and I knew, and that's why, we talked so much before, and we did, and I had heard him read that scene, because I knew that, that the person playing Howie had to be able to deliver it, and I knew Leo could. So on the day, It was a really beautiful day. It was just it was simple, and and he and Rami just sat on that bench and did it. And it's, as a director, you get, chills. And there's always a moment, especially in scenes like that, but there's always a moment where on the first or second take you go, oh, we've got it. We're gonna be fine. Like there's no, it's, the rest is gravy. Now we'll see if we can,
Mm.
here or there. But it was just such a wonderful experience as a director to watch his work in the film and in that scene.
I love that. And
Thank
lastly,
you, Jamie.
Lastly, Leo, I also wanted to ask you about the moment towards the end of the film for Howie, because, in that conversation at the train station, he talks about, he wants to have that confrontational moment and he wants to say to these men, you were confessing all of this in front of someone who's Jewish. And actually, what we see in reality, it ends up playing out very differently. We kind of see him helping one of the men put his shirt on when he's struggling to go into the execution. And I was just curious about, what you found in playing that moment, because it feels like it surprises even him so much in how he responds in that instance.
I think it's a really beautiful beat in the movie. Not, and I thought that before, we shot it. It's just the fact that it's included in that script, I thought was wonderful, because, what it was also, he ends up helping and kind of comforting the man who he personally has the most hatred for. And I think him when he's really faced with the choice, he chose peace, and he chose care for another human being. And I think it's a really important lesson for us all to learn. It could have easily gone another way, and I think he would have been kind of, I don't know, justified in kicking this dog while he was down, but he didn't. And it's not just because Harry's a good man, it's because, you think he knew that enough hatred had been spread, and there just wasn't room for any more.
No, I think that's a wonderful point, and just want to congratulate both of you on a fantastic movie, and thank you so much for talking about it today.
Thank you, Mara.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.